Welcome back to another edition of the Hart2Heart Podcast. And what I'm going to chat about today is my nutrition. And specifically, I'm going to go through my entire diet and tell you exactly what I eat. So, we all know that, diet is just the foundation of health, just like sleep, just like exercise and sunlight. Those are kind of the big four for me. Of course, there's other things in there as well, like, having a good social life, having some kind of spirituality if you really want to, round it out, maybe those top six would be it. But, we all know that diet is certainly a cornerstone of health, and how you eat is going to affect how you feel, how you move, how you recover, your overall cognition, really just everything in general. The saying that you are what you eat is in fact true overall. And so, I've really dialed in my diet over the years, and I know that, by going through this today, it certainly may look a little extreme in some ways, but again, this is what I do probably, at least 5 out of 7 days a week, and it looks mostly like that on the other 2 days a week as well. But, sometimes I do go out to eat. I may indulge, a little bit more than, what I'm getting into here today, but this is for the most part what I do, 5 days a week, basically perfectly to a T. And then the other 2 days, maybe about 50 to 75%, looks exactly like this. And so I'm just going to get into it here. Okay. So when I wake up in the morning, I don't actually have I don't do any intermittent fasting. I just go straight into a morning shake. And so I found that in the past, when I've done intermittent fasting, I've just had a little bit more trouble gaining muscle. And also too, a lot of the research now does suggest that, it is better to eat more of your calories actually, in the morning and the early afternoon as opposed to later at night. And I know that's a little bit inconvenient for some people to hear. And, for me, it is as well, because, in the past I have done, quite a bit of intermittent fasting, and I've just found that, eating later on in the day really is just more convenient for me overall. But unfortunately, it doesn't really line up with our circadian rhythm, as well as, when you stack your calories a little bit earlier in the day. And even for myself now, when I'm going through this diet, I'm still not doing that perfectly overall. I still have, quite a few calories, later on in the daytime, which I'll get into. And then just one kind of quick note again on, intermittent fasting and total caloric intake and all that kind of stuff. So, the timing of your meal certainly does make a difference, as I just mentioned, but the number one thing by far is still going to be your total caloric intake for the day and your total protein intake. Those two things are, so important overall that, when you look at timing, it kind of like pales in comparison in terms of overall importance. So, if you are someone who finds that intermittent fasting is really effective for you, then, maybe don't change things too much, because, if it's already working for you, why, try to, fix something or tweak something when you're only probably going to get, minor benefits overall, because again, it's the total caloric intake, your total protein intake, those are the main things that are really going to drive your overall body composition. So what do I put in that morning shake? So I have whey protein. Okay. People often ask me what kind I use. I'm not affiliated with this company in any way, but I use ATP Labs. I've used those products for years, and I generally use either the grass-fed whey or the whey isolate. Those are the two that I always use. So I have 1 scoop of that, and then I'll have 15 grams of collagen. So I use full spectrum collagen. So most collagen out there is just types 1 and 3, which is great for your skin, your hair, your nails. Type 2 is one that's really good for your joints. But there are several different types of collagen. It goes through 1 through 5. I think there's actually a number 10 as well. So the one that I use has 5 different types of collagen, and that's what I put in my morning shake. And again, I go with about 15 grams. I also do 5 grams of creatine in that shake. I do 5 grams of creatine later pre-workout in the day as well. The reason why I do this really is twofold. So first of all, we know that creatine is good for your muscles, can generate ATP, give you a little bit more of a lift in the gym overall. But we also are finding now, and this is kind of all over social media now, especially if you look at X and Instagram both. It's really good for your brain health. So creatine, can be considered to be nootropic. Some people would say that it's a neuroprotectant and it can stave off Alzheimer's disease and neurodegenerative diseases. So by using, creatine in the morning, I am going to get potentially a little bit of that nootropic effect. And then also too, just by splitting the doses, you're likely going to get better absorption overall. So, having 5 grams earlier in the day, 5 grams later in the day is going to give you better absorption. In addition to the creatine, then we're going to put in some greens and reds by ATP. So, use whatever greens product you want to, put in if you do want to follow, what I'm doing or go along with what I'm doing. I just use the ATP greens and reds products because there's no sort of like fattish ingredients in there, and they don't add anything in extra outside of just trying to replace fruits and vegetables. A lot of these other products will add like probiotics, prebiotics, vitamins, minerals. Again, not that those are, a bad thing to add in. It's just that when I'm, trying to, the purpose of me using it is really just to get a little bit more of a serving of fruits and vegetables. And so, that's why I use that particular product. And the last thing that I put in the shake is 3 grams of glycine. So we know that, dopamine is really effective, dopamine and norepinephrine for increasing your mood, focus, kind of just getting going in the morning, stress resilience. But in addition to that, you also want to have high GABA levels. And so high GABA levels kind of gives you that calmness. And so, that's where you get this sort of like calm energy where you can really focus and do a lot of work. And so that's part of the reason why I put glycine in there, because glycine can work on those GABA receptors. And if you missed a post that I did earlier this week, that'd be the same reason why they add taurine, say, to energy drinks. So a lot of people think that, just because Red Bull and some of these other energy drinks have taurine in them, that taurine must be something that's very stimulatory or that gives you a lot of energy. And it's not there to do that. Taurine, again, can act on GABA or increase GABA. And by having more GABA, we get that sort of calm focus. And so with caffeine and the GABA, that's when you're going to get that real synergistic effect where you feel energized, but you also just feel relaxed and like you can get some work done. So that's my morning shake, which I have, usually around somewhere between 8 and 8:30. I get up usually around 7 a.m. So I have that about an hour after. One thing I should mention too, I know I just did a podcast on supplements, but I do use LMNT or LMNT. So it's an electrolyte based beverage in the morning as well. But I usually have that immediately when I get up. So, within like 5-10 minutes of waking kind of thing. Whereas this usually comes a little bit later after I shower and kind of just before I go out the door. So my first real meal of the day is going to be 4 eggs. I usually have this somewhere between 10 to 10:30 a.m. So, I'll finish cooking my eggs, somewhere close to 8:30. And then I have this, I bring them usually to work, or if I'm at home, obviously I just eat them at home. I've seen studies that say you shouldn't have, eggs out for about 2 hours or so. Any more than that, may pose you at risk of having salmonella or some kind of reaction. And so that's the reason why timing is for having those 4 eggs at that particular time. And just to sort of backtrack, so the total content or the total macros in the morning shake, so it's around 242 calories, around 47 grams of protein, 10 grams of carbs, 2 grams of fat, 3 grams of fiber. Just wanted to mention that. Coming back to my breakfast, so I'll have 4 eggs, leave the yolk in, and then in addition to having the eggs, not always right around that time, but maybe just a little bit after, I will have a Quest bar. And so this is going to bring my total calories for the eggs and the Quest bar for about 500 calories, 48 grams of protein, 24 grams of carbs, which is mostly fiber in the Quest bar, and then 30 grams of fat, 14 grams of fiber. Again, so you can see that, a lot of the fiber coming, or the carbohydrate intake in that particular meal is going to be from the Quest bar. So there's a lot of fiber in Quest bars. And then I usually use the one, or usually eat the one that's the chocolate brownie one, just because it is lower overall in saturated fat. I know there's lots of people out there who are, not terribly afraid of saturated fat, and I get that. I respect your opinion on that. I'm still, a little bit careful about my overall saturated fat intake. And so I think there's 1.5 grams of saturated fat in that particular Quest bar, so fairly low overall. Obviously, in the eggs, there's quite a bit, but again, I'm not completely terrified of saturated fat. I'm just, cognizant of how much I'm eating overall. And so I know that, I'm eating up part of my saturated fat intake, by eating those 4 eggs. But again, there's just so many reasons to eat eggs: high protein, high choline, high B vitamins. It's also too just great in the morning because it's really light on my stomach. So I almost feel like I didn't really eat too much when I eat it. So overall, that's great. Some people are worried about the erythritol content that's in some of the Quest bars. I've done some research on that, and it seems like you have to have at least 30 grams or more a day for this to have any kind of negative effect. Or they've said that it was potentially cause like a stroke overall. But for me and myself, like I have a fairly high CBC and hematocrit. Again, when you keep your testosterone levels high, you are probably going to have higher red blood cell production overall. That's going to lead to higher hematocrit and higher hemoglobin. And so, my risk for, having some kind of like stroke, like hemorrhagic stroke, is fairly lower because of that overall. And then, like I said, you'd have to have at least about 30 milligrams or more. The Quest bar, I think, only has 5. Maybe it has 10. I think it's only 5 though. So again, I'm not even like close to the overall threshold for that. And so it's not something that I'm, terribly worried about overall for me. But again, obviously, everyone has different genetics. Everyone has different risk factors for different things. If you are someone who's at risk for, hemorrhagic stroke, then, maybe stay away from Quest bars. Something maybe you want to discuss with your doctor, or just, look into a little bit more research if you want to. But for me, for myself and my risk, I think that having the Quest bar is completely fine. I'm not worried about it at all. So later on in that morning, or, maybe around 12 o'clock, maybe a little bit later, I've become really obsessed with beef jerky. So people often ask me, which ones I use. There's one called Better Bovine that I often use. And then Wild Meadow Farms actually makes a great one as well. So those are the 2 ones that I usually use. The Better Bovine, I mean, the macros on this are unbelievable. It's like 130, 140 calories, 30 grams of protein, 4 grams of carbs, almost 0 fat. So, just unbelievable in terms of macros overall. And then I may actually have another one of those later on. So, I may have my first one at, 1 o'clock. I may have another one though at, say, like 3 o'clock or something like that. So that's mostly what I eat in the morning and up until my pre-workout. Again, some days are different because some days I will be, working out a little bit earlier in the day. Like today's a Sunday, I'm going to be working out a little bit earlier. It's 12:29 now. I'm going to be working out around, 1:30. But some days, I do work till 6 p.m. Don't get home till a little bit later. And so because of that, I do have to make sure that I'm getting some protein throughout the day, like I just mentioned. But, things do change throughout the week, and, some of the days can be a little bit different. In terms of what I will have, pre-workout, in terms of like a meal. So first of all, I will go through with the shake as well, but I'll just go through with the meal that I have first. So, I've really gotten into this habit of just having 1 slice of gluten-free sourdough bread. I find it just gives me a little bit of extra energy overall, before going into a workout. And I'll usually have a tablespoon, maybe even a little bit more. I don't measure it out perfectly, of almond butter with it. And again, the total macros in there are going to be around 200 calories, maybe around 5 grams of protein. So not too much protein there. 23 grams of carbs, 10 grams of fat, a couple grams of fiber, that should be 5 grams of fiber in that. So the particular sourdough, bro, it's a sour dough bread I get actually has about 5 grams of fiber in a slice. I find that to be, really solid overall before going into a workout. Just makes me feel like I'm not hungry. So I don't have to think about, being hungry during my workout. So, you don't get that like hangry feeling. And then also too, the almond butter provides a little bit more of a satiating feeling because of the fat. And then the sourdough bread with the fiber, content also, has a little bit of a satiating feeling, makes you feel full. So you're not, starving during your workout. In addition to that little pre-snack though, I am going to have then a pre-workout shake. So my pre-workout shake is going to be 5 grams of creatine. I'm going to do 10 grams of L-citrulline and then 1.8 to 2 grams of beta-alanine. I think my scoop is around 1.8, but I just try to take a little bit of like a heaping serving so I get just a little bit more. It's fairly low caloric shake. It's going to be under 50 calories. Not really hardly even, worth counting kind of towards your total caloric intake for the day. But the creatine, as I mentioned before, and I did recently do a podcast on all the supplements I take, but the creatine is going to help with the ATP. More ATP you generate, more energy you're going to have. The L-citrulline, that's really good for your vasodilation, increasing nitrous oxide production, and just giving you a little bit of overall pump in the gym. It can also really be good, potentially even just for some cardiovascular conditions. There's actually been studies that have shown that L-citrulline together with Viagra or Cialis or whatever your PDE5 inhibitor is, Levitra, I guess would be the other one, can actually work synergistically together. So some people do take those both at the same time to make their PDE5 inhibitor a little bit more potent overall. And then the beta-alanine, I've mentioned before. Again, I've done podcasts on supplements, but not also on zone 2 cardio. And this is, somewhere where beta-alanine comes in, but maybe more on the HIIT aspect of the cardio, the high intensity interval cardio. So we know that when we exhaust ourselves, we get kind of this burning lactic acid feeling that can come up, and that can be the reason why we may have to stop a particular workout or just can't do any more on a particular set. The beta-alanine can actually delay that. And so because of that, people sometimes, not oftentimes, not making any crazy claims, can do a little bit more work, do have better overall endurance with a little bit of beta-alanine. So those are the 3 big things that I take pre-workout. I have experimented with HMB before. So HMB, that's going to be the metabolite of leucine. So we made it for branched chain amino acids before. Branched chain amino acids, they've become popular as sort of like muscle preserving, not necessarily muscle building, but muscle preserving. Leucine is the main branched chain amino acid. And the metabolite of leucine is HMB, which is what I'm talking about. And so that maybe can help preserve some, muscle during your workout. So, if you're someone who's, working out in like a fasted state, like having a little bit of HMB may actually be effective for in helping preserve that muscle so you don't go into a catabolic state or breaking down muscle during your workout. So I don't really do anything for an intra-workout shake per se. I just have water and another little bit of LMNT. So the electrolyte drink I was discussing earlier. And just so you know, if you want to, mimic that particular drink, there's 1 gram of sodium in each serving. And it also has some potassium and some magnesium in there. I think it's 200 milligrams of potassium and 80 milligrams of sodium, something like that. But just double check in case you want to look into that a little bit further. So what do I have after my shake? We always, hear people talk about, the post-workout shake as being one of the big things, more important things for building muscle. So I have another 2 scoops of whey, and then I just have some berries with it. and then I'll have some zucchini and some cucumber. So the 2 scoops of whey, obviously that's for building muscle, getting some, whey in and some protein in right after you do your workout. The blueberries, there's so many different reasons to take blueberries. Blueberries can actually be nootropic, believe it or not. But they also have tons of antioxidants. There's fiber in there. Lots of different reasons to take blueberries, lots of different reasons why they're so popular as a health food, because they do have so many different benefits overall. And they're actually not super high in sugar compared to a lot of different fruits as well. So, I'm a really big fan of berries, for all those different reasons. And they taste delicious as well. So whatever, you mix with berries, usually, you kind of get that berry taste in there that makes it just a little bit more delicious. In addition to the blueberries and the whey, I do have half a zucchini or half a cucumber. Again, those are both great different vegetables. They have, different properties that can be helpful overall, but, good antioxidant support. They have some lutein in there, which is really good for your eyes. So, lots of different reasons why you want to, add in some vegetables into maybe somewhere throughout the day, and for myself, I just always found that it's easier in some ways just to drink vegetables as opposed to eat them. So, I do put them in my shake. And then the total caloric content for this shake is going to be around 360 calories, just over 50 grams of protein, 34 grams of carbs, and less than 4 grams of fat. So, higher protein intake and, moderate carbohydrate intake post-workout. So moving on from my post-workout shake and getting into dinner, and this would be my, biggest meal of the day, by far. And so what I usually do for dinner is, I do do a lot of pre-meal prep. Generally I do it every Sunday, like I'm going to be doing it today. This recording's happened on a Sunday. So I'm going to be doing my meal prep this week, today for this week. And in that particular meal for my dinner, I'm going to have 1 pound of grass-fed beef. So, it's quite a bit of grass-fed beef for some people. About 2/3 of a cup of basmati rice. This is be uncooked. And then I'll have an avocado, or, if you go to Costco, you can get these little avocado packs. So you can just put them in the freezer. And then when you want to, use them for the week, you can take a few packs out, put them in your fridge, and then use them before or with your meals. And that's how I use them anyway. And then I will have a little bit of hot sauce with that as well. So I usually get the mild peri-peri one. I used to like the spicier ones, but I have learned that spicy food can actually disrupt your sleep. It can throw off some of your deep sleep and just throw off your whole sleep architecture in general, unfortunately, which is a little bit inconvenient to hear, for a lot of people. I knew it was for me. So I do use more mild spices, unfortunately, at night, because, sometimes my dinner meal can be fairly close to bed. Like, ideally you want to be eating your dinner, 4 hours, almost like plushes, before bed. For me, sometimes it's only 2 to 3 hours, like if that, especially if I'm working late and then I also do a little bit of a later workout. Unfortunately, I just don't get that big gap between dinner and bed. But one little tidbit on that can help with that, if you are someone who is in that situation sometimes, like myself, is by taking some digestive enzymes, you can actually help with the absorption of the meal, and you may get a little bit less of a effect on your sleep from having that late dinner. So just something to consider. And then, looking at the total contents, or the total caloric intake of this meal. So, I'm going to be getting somewhere around 70 grams of protein, with, obviously that mostly coming from the beef. From the carbohydrates, maybe around 70 grams of carbohydrates. And then the fat. So the fat is going to vary quite a bit, because the way that I cook my beef is I actually, cook it very well. I strain it. And then once I strain it, I run hot water over it. So the total fat content for me, again, it's going to vary, a little bit differently from different people, but probably going to be around 30 to 35 grams, which is still fairly high overall. And then about 10 grams of fiber. So in terms of, the caloric content for this meal is going to be somewhere around 700 grams. Again, that may vary, or 700 calories. That may vary though, depending on how you cook your food overall. And then if I do have to have anything after that, I will have some mixed nuts, like some almonds, some cashews, or some pistachios. And then I have gotten into the habit of having a midday square bar. So, I kind of like all the different flavors that it has for that. That may add up to, say, around another 300 calories or so, maybe 350 calories. And then, very minimal protein content in that, maybe 11 to 12 grams, carbohydrates around 20, fat maybe 27, and fiber around 7. And so that's more or less, what I eat most days of the week. So we're going to be looking at somewhere around, 3,200 calories, maybe around 3,000 to 3,200. My protein intake is going to be really high. So somewhere around 250 to 270 grams of protein. And then my carbohydrate intake is usually right around 165 grams. Fat is around 152 and fiber is 41. And so, I usually like to keep my caloric intake right around 300 to between 3,000 and 3,500. That's usually how much I'm burning, according to my aura as well. So I just kind of stay right in that maintenance zone. And that's what works for me. Like I said, sometimes on the weekend, I do, deviate a little bit. I'll go out and eat, at certain restaurants. What do I eat when I go out to eat? Most of the time it's still, some pretty decent food. Like if I go to the Keg, I'll get a shrimp cocktail, 10-ounce filet. I'll get the, bacon off the filet. I'll just have some rice and like mushrooms as my side. Pretty healthy meal really overall. But then there's other times when, I go to an Italian restaurant and I do want to get into a pasta. And, I will certainly indulge. And then with that too, I also will, indulge only ever though on Fridays and Saturdays in a little bit of alcohol. So, I may have a cocktail or two with a beer, something like that. Sometimes I might have 2 beers. And so, I will vary a little bit on those particular days. But overall, this is what I'm eating throughout the day. And I didn't mention this too, but I also will drink some, no calorie or 0 calorie beverages. So, coffee being the big one, I'll probably have about 6 half caffeinated shots of espresso throughout the day. So, Kicking Horse used to make this half caffeinated bean. Now what I do, I just mix a caffeinated bean, a fully caffeinated with decaf. And then that way I can still have 6 cups of coffee or 6 shots of espresso, technically, even though I'm only, getting about 3 cups of coffee in terms of caffeine content. And that way I can have lots of, cups of coffee, which I love, without, crushing the caffeine too much. And then the only other thing that I'll add to that is I will have, I mentioned this on the show before, like Zevia or bubbly. It's just sort of a little bit of an addiction I have, or a guilty pleasure I have. So I'll often have one of those, sometime throughout the night, maybe, after supper, in between supper and bed, something like that. And if it's not Zevia, it's bubbly, one of those 2 that are super low calorie or 0 calorie beverages. And that's basically, what I eat throughout the week, and, a little bit on what I eat on the weekend. So hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. If you have any questions about my diet, if you want to learn a little bit more about, why I do what I do, please leave any questions in the comments and I'll be happy to answer them. But as always, I really appreciate you listening, and I'll be back with another episode soon.